Just a Concerned Citizen by Damos on AO3. Chapter 15 Hero. The person leaning on the doorway, the one that the heroes up above couldn't see from where they were sitting, was big. Too big for Izuku to easily lift over his shoulders and bring back, but absolutely big enough for him to duck behind when he spotted movement further inside the room. Two figures kicked up swirls of smoke as they walked towards him. But Izuku couldn't tell if he'd been spotted, because once he took a moment to understand what he was looking at, he realized that they were wearing hazmat suits that fully obscured their faces. And some distinct part of his mind declared that, as fair, that the gas was also probably one hell of a cognigetic even to quirkless people. He froze, like a prey animal, and for once in his right instinct, it seems like they weren't expecting anyone else down here to be able to move. And neither person made any indication that they seemed to know he was there as they approached another lump on the floor. He couldn't see what it was until they lifted it up, but when he did, his breath caught. All he could do was watch as they lifted up Pinky, one person on each end, and carried her back the way they came. They were taking hostages then. If Izuku considered this from an outside perspective, he really should be freaking out a little more. But as he watched the villains disappear down another hallway, he ran a hand over the rough concrete of the floor and felt instead like he was missing something. They were conclusions he could draw, doubts that had been raised, but he pushed them to the back of his mind as he tried to figure out how he was going to lift the hero in front of him. Tentacle was almost a foot taller than him, and had 4 extra limbs of muscle to add weight on top of that. The best Izuku could manage was to hook his arm under the hero's armpit and drag him towards the ladder. He could hear the gas from Arabity as soon as he came into sight. Izuku looked up and offered her a shaky smile. I don't think I could lift him high enough. How much can this rope handle? Just about 15 kilos. You should. She frowned. Just be careful. Izuku didn't think that being careful would help much of anything in this case, and his fingers were already working at the knots before she finished talking. The minute or so it took for him to get himself unsecured was agonizing, because he was just watching his hands as he was watching the door. It took another 2 for him and Arabity to figure out how to use the rope in a way that she could fit Tentacle through the gap without hurting him. This was done with Chargeboat watching over her shoulder. Dude, you're really brave, he said. Izuku said. Thanks? He didn't feel especially brave. He felt like this never should have happened in the first place. The 2 heroes above him must have found gloves, which were giving them trouble keeping a grip on the rope as they pulled Tentacle up. Izuku did his best to help from the bottom, but there wasn't much he could do besides support him. As the heroes raised him high enough for the other pros to grab at him properly, Izuku's eyes caught on something strapped to Tentacle's side. Most heroes carried some kind of utility tool as a part of their uniform, and most utility tools came with some kind of knife. Tentacle was no exception, and Izuku found himself grabbing at it before he realized what he was doing. The underground hero was large enough that he blocked Arabity and Chargebolt view from him, so they shouldn't have seen what he had just done, and Izuku looked at the object in his hand with a bit of shock. If he backtracked, his thought process had been something like, this will be useful when I go back in, which, well, he wasn't planning on going back, was he? The lights flickered. The tingling on his thing hasn't really grown any worse. If he got caught, he was worth very little as a captive compared to the top-ranking heroes that were somewhere deeper inside. But they were also certainly interested in him if their botched attempts of his life had meant anything. Nothing of what he had just thought sounded particularly good for his health. Maybe he could spin himself as another quirkless person looking to join their cause or something? Huh. He was going back in, wasn't he? Which Arabity at least would certainly argue with, but it wasn't like she was actually going to be able to stop him. Not down here, at least. Better to just save them both the time. He heard her say, "Wait, oh my god!" But he was already outside. He crept forward, onto the hallway, and into a room with tanks, keeping low to the ground because if all else fails, he could try and duck beneath the smoke and crawl away. Fiddling with the tools as he he was able to flip the knife open. Ideally, he'd be using it to cut ropes instead of fight, but it was a comforting weight in his hand, all the same. He usually didn't have the luxury of having something to defend himself with. He paused as he passed each tank, scanning for more forms hidden in the smoke, and coming up with nothing. Anyone else who had been in here had been taken away, probably to where Pinky was. If he had to guess, but that direction was a long, featureless hallway that left him nowhere to hide if villains came back. The other directions were mostly pipe tunnels, disappearing into the walls and presumably into the next room over. He hesitated for a brief moment before moving that way, because if there were pipes, that meant more places to hide, and he needs more information. As he ducked through the doorway and around the corner, Izuku took a moment to breathe. The smoke was less here, and that meant he had a better idea of what he was doing. The room was a tangle of pipes and machinery that Izuku vaguely recognized from his research, and his best guess was that this was probably the room where they manufactured the stuff. At the far end of the room was a table, but it looked like it was a mess, like someone had gone through everything on it in a hurry. The room felt like it was both cluttered and empty at the same time. In fact, the whole place felt sort of unfinished. None of the doorways actually had any doors. The lighting was cheap, buzzing loudly even as they flickered. Every surface that wasn't metal was identical, featureless concrete that looked almost too perfect, too clean. Izuku hung close to the wall as he skirted around the edge of the room, sparring one last glance around before darting over the table and rifling through what was left. Unfortunately, there was no manifesto outlining a grand plan, just scratchy writing about chemicals and tests and failures that, while probably important, Izuku couldn't start to figure out right now. Taking those notes might have been the smart thing to do, but if he was going to have both of his hands full, he'd rather it be with something more immediately useful. There were a few unused smoke bombs that had rolled underneath the desk. He grabbed for one of those instead. Even if the smoke inside wouldn't do much, he had a pretty good arm, and the canister was fairly weighty. With that in hand, he kept moving. The room had another doorway that opened to a much smaller, dead-end hallway as he got closer to a new sound registered. The low presence whirl of... He peeked around the corner. A big fan that was sitting at the entrance of one of the two rooms that the hallway opened to keep the smoke out, presumably, and the doubts kept piling up. Across from it was a room that did have a door, one that looked heavy. He was almost at the door when there was a faint, staticky crackle, and then a composed voice saying, "You sure?" A click, the status went quiet, and then a woman's voice, much closer, saying, "One in, two out," twice. Then one in and not out yet. I don't know what else to tell you. No response left the woman murmuring something like, "Go into security," they said. But Izuku wasn't listening to that anymore. They knew he was here, which was bad, but he hadn't seen any cameras. One of the things that Mindjack had suspected in the original warehouse raid was someone with a surveillance quirk, and whoever was in the room was certainly doing their best not to let the smoke get to them. He didn't know if he wanted to be wrong or not, but there was one way to test his theory, and he just grabbed it. Carefully balancing the knife on his knees, he took the canister of gas in both hands. Setting it off was as simple as pulling a ring on the top, and having never really seen a smoke bomb in use before, he was startled by the sparks that spewed forth. He didn't yelp, but he almost dropped the thing, and it rapidly warmed in his hands. He darted over to the door and threw it in at the first figure he saw. His aim was true because there was a shout, then a thump, and he was looking at the collapsed form of a woman who could have passed for just a random mid-level worker for the chemical plant, lying in a rapidly expanding cloud of smoke. She stared up at him, but seemed otherwise unable to move. "Okay," he breathed out. "So you have a quirk, then?" She, predictably, didn't respond. It could just be a fluke. She could be sympathetic to whatever cause these people are fighting for, or she could have no idea what she'd gotten herself into. But the perfectly identical stone of the floor in the room said otherwise. To be honest, this just raised more questions than he could answer right now. A quick glance around the room showed that it was as unfinished as the others. There was a big metal console installed into one wall, but the wires behind it were stripped bare. Even if there had been cameras, no one would have been able to see them. Not that Izuku really needed further confirmation of the woman's quirk. Before Izuku could think too deeply about that, the radio clipped to the woman's belt loop and crackled to life again, and a new voice said, "My room's clear." Right. Figure that out later. He was on a bit of a timer now, and if they found him here, he'd be cornered. Peeking back around the corner showed that the room he came from was as empty as it was when he left it. He should leave. Should make sure that he had an exit to run to. But the door just across the hall was the first one he'd seen that had a big metal bar across it like it was trying to keep something in. They hadn't brought Pinky this way, but that didn't mean he should just dismiss this as nothing. He took a few steps across and pulled at the bar, which slid back with a grind and a clank that was far too loud for Izuku's taste. He hefted the knife in one hand and slid the door open to find another room, this one totally empty except for a plate on the wall which was chained to a person curled up in the corner. She blinked up, weirdly, at the noise, and though he'd only met her once, very briefly, Izuku would recognize those blue and black splotches anywhere. He was probably supposed to say something reassuring, but before he could, Ayo Nakano sat up and pointed a finger at him, eyes wide. She said, You're the vigilante guy." Well, he's technically had permission. "I'm just here to help." Trapping himself in a corner, be damned, he wasn't going to leave a hostage chained to a wall. So he slipped through the door, and Nanako obliquely held out her ankle. While the door didn't have a lock, the shackle did, and he wasn't sure he had the time to go searching for keys. The multi-tool in his hand had pliers on it. Sure, but the chain was too thick for it to cut through. How did you find me?" Nanako asked, as Izuku ran his eyes up the chain to where it was in depth into the wall. Just like everything else, it had been done in a hurry, and was secured with 4 screws that he did have the tools to loosen. He wedged the blade of the knife in one and started twisting it before he realized he should respond. "Thank Mind Jack for that." Had they met? Did she know who he was? "I'm just here because he is." There was a long moment of silence between them, as he pulled one screw out of the wall and moved to the next. He felt like his hands should be shaking, but they were surprisingly steady. That would probably come afterwards. Then, for now, he needed all the help he could get. "So, could you tell me anything about this place? The people here?" Nanako sat up a little straighter and breathed in. "Right, there's the person that usually comes to see me, always wears his full body chemical suit. Get up, and he doesn't talk much. There are these 2 big guys, who I think were probably the ones who grabbed me, both times." Her voice wavered a bit, and Izuku offered her a smile as he pulled another screw loose. One of them has some kind of strength enhancing quirk that makes him glow. I'm not sure about the other one, but he told me he had a mutant quirk. There's someone here who can control stone, too. That's how they made this room, I think. Izuku pulled out the third screw, feeling a little lightheaded. So, they're not quirkless. I was wrong. Good to know. Unfortunately, he liked to ramble when nervous, so he also said, "Must have forgotten we exist. Or they just don't care." Said Nanako. "What?" "Ah, not important, sorry." He was a little too on edge about everything else to think too hard about what he had just revealed. The last screw was loose enough that he was able to pull the plate out of the wall with a final pull. "Let's get you out of here, huh?" Nanako wasn't really in the state to be walking, though Izuku figured he was going to have to carry her above the gas anyways. He was sure there was some irony to the fact that he was more immune to something made from her quirk than she was. He lifted her onto his back, leaving a free hand to brandish his weapon as she clung to his neck. "Arabity and Chargebolt are waiting just outside," he told her. "They'll take care of you, but we need to be quiet until then." Really, she was the best he could ask for when it came to behavior from someone being rescued. She kept her head turned as they moved through the manufacture room to the one with the tanks to make sure no one appeared behind them. And then they were at the ladder and Arabity was there, looking afraid and livid all at once. Izuku helped Nano onto the ladder. "A civilian," was all the explanation he gave, and he made the turn back into the compound. The idea of going to face villains was somehow more appealing than being lectured by a pro hero. But, of course, Arabity wasn't going to let him go a second time. "Don't you dare run off again!" She yelled at him, too loud, and Izuku found his shoulders hunched up to his ears against his will. "Look, we really appreciate this, but Gale Force is on his way. I can't let you keep running around down there alone in good conscience." Arabity was angry, yes, but she was also worried. That was nice of her. Izuku couldn't promise that he'd be fine. Nothing about this was fine. But that didn't matter, because now that he was here, he didn't plan on running away. Not anymore. Instead, he said, "I know their quirks, which means they have them, which means they've given me the best advantage I'm ever going to get in my life. I don't have to fight anyone." He brandished the knife. "I just have to give them a taste of their own medicine." Her frown didn't ease even a little, so he gave her his most reassuring smile and said, "I know how dangerous this is. If something happens to me, it's not on you. It's because I was being stupid." She didn't yell at him again. In Hitoshi's opinion, the worst thing about whatever was keeping him paralyzed was that it was also keeping him conscious. He was awake as he was carried away and tossed to the ground. He was fully aware as he heard backup come only to meet the same fate he had. He couldn't do a damn thing as he felt them pull his support items off of him, as he listened to voices talking about how they got 2 of the top 10. Every bit of exposed skin, not much for him, thankfully, tingled and burned. It felt like it took every ounce of his energy to just breathe. It took too much time and so much effort to force his eyelids open. The only light in the room was flickering in from somewhere he couldn't see, long shadows dancing back and forth as people moved around in front of it. As his eyes adjusted, he did his best to look around. Everything was bare concrete, and if he didn't know where he was, he would have guessed an unfinished construction site. He wasn't alone either. His view was blocked a bit by a person in front of him, Vank Blad, looking significantly worse for wear than when he last seen him. But he could see enough. They must have been confident in their gas to keep 4, 5, counting him, pro heroes in the same room, unsecured like this. Shetta and Ground Zero were tied back to back with a rope that wouldn't last a second if either of them got the chance to activate their quirks. Unfortunately, they probably wouldn't. Most of the dark glass was curling around on the ground near them, coming from somewhere in the darkness, that he couldn't see. Out of the corner of his eye was a pile of black something, which he could only guess was Tokoyami. If Tentacle was here, Hitoshi couldn't see him. For now, all he could do was wait and pray that the smoke didn't creep any closer to him, sweat beading on his forehead as the legs of people in a haze mask suit swarmed through his vision. They talked, sometimes. He took a grim pleasure in the fact that they seemed totally unprepared for this many heroes to show up so soon. It sounded like they were coming up with some kind of horrible plan to use them as hostages and stage another getaway. He had only a vague idea how long it was before a change happened. A voice over a radio saying that someone had come in. He had assumed the worst, that someone else had gotten too hasty, and he was about to see another one of his friends dragged in and unable to move. Then the voice came back saying two had left, and oh, thank fuck! Someone must have figured something out. A minute later, and the voice came back saying that it had happened again, and Hitoshi allowed himself to hope for a brief moment before two more set of legs appeared and dropped Pinky right at the edge of his vision. She looked fairly awake, at least, which in this case meant that her eyes were open and looking around. Maybe she hadn't been in the smoke long, or maybe her acid helped negate the effects? She was looking suspiciously shiny, but her appearance opened a hole in his chest. She had saved someone and gotten caught? What the hell was going on? A few more minutes had him thinking that maybe it wasn't Pinky they were worried about after all, as the villains continued to scurry in and out of his line of sight. If he really pushed, he could just lift his head, though it sent pain screaming through his every muscle in his neck and shoulders to try. A movement of the eyes caught with Pinky, who lifted her chin at him, told him that she was in the same boat. No one else was moving at all, but he could work with this, somehow, given more time. Well, he didn't have more time, if the shouted shout of alarm was anything to go by. There was a yelp, a shout, then a clunk hiss of another smoke bomb being thrown. Someone was saying, "Fucker's immune or something. We know his quirk?" The response came in the form of a voice that Hitoshi should not be hearing right now. Midoriya was here? Somehow, and he sounded almost disappointed? "You really don't even know what you have here, do you?" Someone growled a response. Something was glowing red, and someone, no, not someone, Midoriya, was tossed into the room, air leaving him with a loud grunt, gas swirling around them, and casting haunting shadows over the whole scene. One of the villains followed him, and the fact that Hitoshi couldn't move while the man he'd been trying to keep alive was pinned to the ground, not 3 meters away from him, was agony. Only, well, Midoriya did something. Twisted his arms around in a way that couldn't have felt nice, got one of those hands loose enough to struggle with it. The person who had him pinned was so big that, really, it shouldn't have made a difference. But something metal flashed in the light. There was a rip of plastic, and after a few more moments of struggle, the person in the hazmat suit went down, and Midoriya pulled himself free and jumped to his feet. He looked hurt. There was a long scrape down his side of his face, and blood leaking from his nose. He was flexing one of his wrists, like he was trying to see how far it could still bend, and there was a dark stain on one of his shoulders, whose origins were unclear. He was also smiling, like he was comfortable in his own skin for once, eyes bright and shoulders straight, as he looked at the pile of heroes on the ground and asked, "I don't guess any of you can move, can you?" Hitoshi blinked. He was pretty sure Pinky did too, which raised the question of just how exactly Midoriya was still standing when no one else seems capable of doing so right now. The smile dimmed as Midoriya said, "Yeah, I thought so." The green-haired man took another glance around, puffed a resigned sigh, and then moved to Ground Zero and Shoto were tied together, working at the ropes with the revealed itself to be a utility knife. Some part of Hitoshi, the part that was absolutely hysterical over the fact that Midoriya was here, why the hell was he here, was proud. The higher-ranking heroes were far more valuable as hostages. Getting them out should be his first priority, and Midoriya was calm enough to make that call, even when he probably had a very good reason to want to leave the number 4 for last. He cut through the ropes and looked to be trying to figure out the best way to carry a much bulkier than him Ground Zero when his hand shot up, eyes fixed on something. Hitoshi couldn't quite see. It only took a moment, though, as another set of shadows passed through the light. Another set of footsteps got closer and closer. There were 2 people in hazmat suits, 2 more villains, and when Midoriya got to his feet, it was to stand between them and the pros. If he was afraid, Hitoshi couldn't tell. No, from his spot on the ground, all he could think was, is this how people felt when heroes show up to save them? Still, 2-on-1 was one hell of a disadvantage for someone who knew how to fight, and Midoriya didn't. What he did know how to do, as Hitoshi quickly learned, was not get hit. Or at least not get hit hard. Someone threw a punch, and he rabbited away from it. Someone shifted the ground under his feet, and he stumbled, but he didn't fall. Someone grabbed at him, and he lunged out with the knife in response, ripping through his sleeve, and then it was 1-on-1 instead of 2. And he always kept himself between them and the villains. Hitoshi fought his hardest in the meantime. He could twitch his fingers. Maybe if he could open his mouth, he could just... You. A new voice, one that startled everyone who was capable into looking at it. I figured you out. I know just how you're able to run around down here. How the fuck are you taking their side? Hitoshi could just see Midoriya's face, in profile, frowning. Their side? Like, the heroes? That side? You must have been real damn lucky in life if you think they actually care about you. You know them? Do they know you're Quirkless? Izuku's nose wrinkled. Most of them? The villain that Hitoshi could see took the opportunity to lunge forward, and this time Midoriya wasn't quick enough to dodge it. A hand pinned the wrist with the knife, sending it spinning away, and the 2 went tumbling to the floor, with a crack that Hitoshi would have winced at if he could. Something just broke there. He just hoped it wasn't a skull. And anyways, he had more important things to be worried about, like the fact that Midoriya was struggling under someone who was likely trying to kill him, while his tongue was still too heavy in his mouth to make a sound. He stared at the shadowy mess of struggling limbs, and Hitoshi was half convinced he was about to see Midoriya die. And then one arm reached over and there was a rip, snap of what must have been either a zipper being torn open or the seams around it ripping because Midoriya was pulling himself out from under the person to a moment later, breathing noticeably more ragged. And then, as if he hadn't just been fighting for his life, Midoriya pointed to the figure. Hitoshi could tell where they were by the long stretched shadows in the doorway now, and said, Are you Quirkless? Because everything about this makes a lot more sense if someone here is. The silence was telling. Midoriya gestured at the figure on the ground, the one he'd knocked out. Do they know? I want to know what the plan here was. Did they support you? Is this some kind of kill all heroes, tear down society thing? I don't want to kill heroes. I want an even playing field, which I would have, we would have, if you just leave me alone. I mean, Midoriya licked his lips, and Hitoshi could see his eyes roaming the room. I get it, but you were also kind of kidnapping people. We let them go. The person was making their way into the room now. We didn't hurt anyone. Midoriya opened his mouth, closed it, looked conflicted. For a brief and terrible moment, Hitoshi thought he might agree. And then he kicked himself for even having the thought, as he changed subjects entirely. You have a guy here who can disorientate people and make them forget things. Why not use his quirk? The girl I pulled out of here looked pretty hurt to me. And, oh, he was doing something Hitoshi did all the time. Distracting, deflecting, trying to get information, trying to buy time. You can't just slap a quirk factor into the Hesse compounds and call it a day. The right combinations of chemicals and quirk. Ugh, shut up. No, I'm not having a conversation with some vigilante, hero, sympathizer, betrayer. I'm not a. Midoriya looked downright offended for a moment before his face morphed into shock, and then fear. Shit. Midoriya took off running towards a shadow, and then a lot of things happened in quick succession. The first was the explosion. Hitoshi had seen, or in this case, heard, Ground Zero use the max capacity of his gauntlets, maybe twice, ever, and never from this close. But that was unmistakably what had been set off. Well, that answered the question of where the support items were. For a long moment, too long, he couldn't tell what was going on. The sudden brightness had him forcing his eyes back closed, and he knew that the sound would have his ears ringing for days. Small bits of something were raining down on him, and every time one hit, it hurt. It sent pins and needles radiating painfully through his whole body. And then there was the wind. Strong. Too strong to be natural. And when Shinsou finally pried his eyes back open, it was to the tune of a hole in the roof, though which the floors of the buildings above were still sliding. And one gale force descending into the room with a team of sidekicks behind him. Not what he cared about right now. No, he did everything he could to crane his neck to look around until he saw Midoriya. Still standing, even with a new, huge, nasty-looking burn that sprained up his entire left arm and had scorched away most of his shirt. He was talking, gesturing to jail force, and then to the heroes, and then somewhere in the compound behind him. Hitoshi couldn't hear what he was saying, and based on the blood coming out of his ears, Midoriya couldn't hear himself either. Hitoshi tried to focus. He wasn't half bad at lip reading, and so he got the gist of the explanation. Paralyzing, skin-based, gloves, Van Black might need a stretcher, but the rest can be carried out. Someone sent down a ladder, and Gale Force, the sidekicks, moved to start carrying people out. Midoriya did too. With the other heroes accounted for, Midoriya made a beeline straight to him. He said something like, "It's okay, the heroes are here now." Hitoshi wanted to shake him and ask Midoriya what the fuck he thought he's been doing up until now, if not heroism. He'll have to do that later. His thoughts were quickly derailed by Midoriya pulling him onto his shoulder, piggyback, and by the fact that, since he couldn't really move his own body, his face wound up right in the crook of the man's neck. Not that he would move it, but this whole day had been very bad on his heart, and this really wasn't helping. The heroes that had arrived really shouldn't let Midoriya do what he was doing either, but right now he was being treated as the authority on the situation, which, he was. They just had no idea how injured the man currently carrying him over his back really was. He seriously doubted that Midoriya was going to say anything either. No, he had to suffer in silence as he was carried out of the chemical plant and over to the ambulance. He didn't know what to make of any of this. Midoriya wasn't even supposed to be here, and yet he'd shown up, had stopped the villains from using anyone as a hostage, had absently saved their lives, and done it with a smile. Every bit of advice about romance in the hero industry basically boiled down to nut up or shut up. Things were too dangerous to spend time pining. People could die before you got the chance to confess, and then you would have to live with that forever. Today had been proof of not only that fact, but the fact that Midoriya Izuku was brilliantly smart, and brave, and bright, and cute, so damn cute. And all that, despite everything that he's been through. He still wanted to help, even when it would have been so easy for him to give up or turn against everyone. He sure as hell deserved better from Hitoshi than him sitting on his hands about his own damn feelings. Fuck. He was going to have to say something. He couldn't yet, though. Literally, still couldn't. Though the fact that he could move his tongue again at all was a good sign. Midoriya carried him into an ambulance and smiled down at him. and Hitoshi's heart swelled with equal parts worry and affection, because he kind of looked like shit. By now, the ringing had died down enough that Hitoshi could start to hear a bit, so when Midoriya stepped out of the ambulance, he heard the EMT ask Midoriya if he needed medical attention, to which the man airily responded, "Oh, yeah, probably." Then he heard the thump of someone hitting the ground. Yeah, that tracked. Izuku for the save. I love that. I love this chapter so much. I remember when I first read it, the whole time I was like, oh my god, and then what? Oh my god, and then what? No way, what? The whole time was just, I actually took me longer to read that chapter when I first read it, because I kept having to stop, and I'm like, okay, wait, hold up. Oh my god. It was a bit of a hassle reading it. Also, I really hate reading fighting scenes and all that stuff. I know some people really love those type of scenes. I really hate reading those type of scenes sometimes, because most of the time they're written not like badly, but like emphasis is on the parts that aren't really important, and I get kind of bored, and like I just want the payoff. Like, I'm sitting there, I'm like, okay, this is fun and all, you're writing it really nice and all, I want the payoff, give me the payoff, right? And in this sense, I think the writer, Dominoes, you did a great job. If you're listening, I don't think you're listening. You did a good job at doing the payoff, because I feel like part of the payoff is Izuku rescuing people, because this whole time Izuku hasn't been a hero, hasn't even seen himself as a hero, and he's finally doing something heroic. I remember the first time I read this, I actually read the fighting scenes and all that, which, again, really weird for me. Normally I skip through. Normally, like, I skim read. Like, it's like I read super fast, and like I retain half of the information and retain none of the information at the same time. Like, in one ear, out the other kind of thing. So I love this chapter. I haven't reread this chapter. This is my second read through, yeah. I also love the conversation Izuku and the other villain, the Quirkless villain, had. I wish that scene was a little bit longer, like there was a bit more of a conversation, but I do really like it. And I think the change of perspective to Hitoshi was a really good payoff, because it leaves the readers of like, okay, we know what's happening, but at the same time, there are moments where we just don't know what the fuck is happening, you know? And nothing like a traumatic, almost death experience to make you realize that you really need to just, you know, get out there and tell your crush that you have feelings. Yup. Sometimes all you need is that little push of a life-threatening experience. And no, yeah, I feel like in the hero industry, many people would be like, hey, you either confess, or what was that thing that they say in marriages? The whole, if anyone goes against this, speak now or forever hold your peace. You better speak up now or forever hold your peace, right? Because yeah, it's a dangerous career. Therefore, it would have a lot of death, right? I probably think, I would imagine that many heroes don't live up to the age of like 30, 40. Like, if you're at 30, 40, you are lucky as hell. And I'm guessing the retirement age is like 40, 50, right? Because at some point, you know, your body stops being as useful as it was youthful, you know? So I feel like, yeah, it makes sense that that would be life advice in the hero industry. Not life advice, but love advice in the hero industry. I also absolutely love the fact that the ETM, or EMT, was like, hey, do you need help? Do you need medical attention? And Izuku was like, oh, yeah, I do. And then passes out. I love that. And you know what? That does track, Hitoshi. You're right. It does track. You know, I feel like Izuku would definitely be that type. You know, the whole like, oh, haha, yeah, 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 forgot, I'm a human. And then pass out. So, this chapter was a really good chapter. It was a really lengthy chapter, too. For those who haven't noticed, I'm just going to make this announcement in this video. For those who haven't noticed, some videos are starting to have the little chapter thingies. The YouTube chapter thingies where you could, you know, see what part of the video is about what. I'm slowly adding that to my videos. It takes a while to add it to every single video. It does take a while. and I'm starting off slow, and at one point this one's gonna have the chapters. And if you're, listening to this and it already has the chapters, well, hi, welcome. Hi, I don't know. This is probably gonna be months ahead when I finally get this one into chapters. But yeah, hopefully I get that done soon when I have time to actually sit and just do that. Alright, well, I think that's all of my notes for now. Yeah, that's all of my notes. As always, my raindrops, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds. Have a wonderful day or night. Link to my Discord server and socials are down in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.